All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. Christianity on the Spectrum is a podcast of around 10 years of ethnographic research into the world of autistic Christians and ex-Christians. It is a data-driven ethnography taking over 26,000 autistic Christians and ex-Christians from online and well over 500 interviews and many, many surveys. And we like to ask questions like, what's going on with autistic Christians? Why are so many autistic Christians X? We've been doing a series about that so far where we've been looking at different online autistic subcommunities and asking why autistic people like to participate in those. This week we are going to be covering one of the larger subcommunities, and that is a movement that is called inclusive orthodoxy. A very wise poster once created a meme of Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of the UK, with the caption riffing off of her popular quote, "The problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money." And this poster boldly, bravely even, edited the quote to say, "The problem with inclusive orthodoxy is that eventually you run out of weird nerds." And to talk about those weird nerds, I have on my guest, Richard Pryor. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, Jonathan. Thank you for having me. My name is Richard Pryor. I'm by training a church historian. My master's from Princeton Seminary. And I'm the creative editor of Earth and Altar, a magazine that is placed squarely in the inclusive orthodoxy tradition. I grew up and live in Ohio, where I work in data analytics. And my academic research is focused on missionary history and sort of questions around race and power and the colonization of consciousness in early 20th century South Africa.
Nice. And also of relevance to this podcast, I don't know if you want to tell people this so we can edit this.
Oh, no, we can.
Don't
I'm also autistic. I'm also an autistic Christian. So I will say when this came through our Discord, our staff Discord, asking for somebody to do this, I was like, well, it's probably better to have the autistic person do it. So here I am.
Fair enough. Awesome. Yeah. So Earth and Altar is sort of, I would say, the locus of distribution for most inclusive Orthodox stuff that you'll find online, and sort of the rallying point that you get. So I just sent them off an email to say, hey, do any of you from this publication want to talk to me? And yeah, Richard volunteered. So glad to have you on the show. So I think this episode, we're going to talk a lot about autistic attitudes on inclusive orthodoxy. And so that covers topics like same-sex marriage, gender, those types of things. And if you want a more detailed breakdown on those, I've already done a few episodes on that. You can go listen to those if you would like. We're going to try not to retread that ground. We might touch on it here and there, but if you want a more detailed presentation, go to those previous episodes. I'll link them in the description. So anyway, let's start off. I've mentioned inclusive orthodoxy a few times on the podcast, but I've never really clearly defined it and clearly defined what it is. So maybe let's start with that. What is inclusive orthodoxy?
You will come to learn that I like to tell stories as a way of answering questions, because it allows me to rope in the people and ideas which made a thing a thing. And I go back to 2015. Michael Curry had just been elected presiding bishop. And he said to the House of Deputies after he was elected that he was a kind of bishop who could say the Nicene and Apostles' Creeds without crossing his fingers behind his back. And I think that's sort of where it starts, is that we believe in the creeds as they've been passed down, the teachings of the church, but we also believe that the things that God has intended for humanity are not to be just solely split up to one gender, and the access to the sacraments in particular, whether it be marriage between two people of any or no genders, ordination, lay leadership, basically that we want to accept you, but we also want to make clear that we're not throwing away all of our beliefs up in the air, that we actually do believe in the creeds that we claim to profess.
Yeah, so I think that's a good broad overview of the movement, but I get a lot of questions about inclusive orthodoxy, and I always have to redirect people to Earth and Altar and say this is where you're actually going to get good answers. I don't know. I'm just a guy, because inclusive orthodoxy, there are a lot of it isn't a centralized movement, right? There isn't like one inclusive orthodoxy institution that is sending out marching orders. It's decentralized, it's grassroots, and it's sort of a collection of willing voluntary associates. Is that sort of accurate,
Yeah,
or would you characterize it differently?
there is no party in the way that like other groups have specific conferences or the like. Earth and Altar, we may do something like that in the future. Who knows? We've been in existence now for a bit over 5 years, and everything keeps changing. So who's to say where that will lead us? But no, it's very much a grassroots thing. It came off of people on Twitter, and then who kept talking about wanting a place for people like us.
Yeah, and so I get lots of questions from people who, whenever I talk about it, who are on the sort of liberal progressive side, saying, "Oh, is this just another way of saying liberal progressive Christian?" What would you say to that, or how would you answer that?
No, it's not. So inclusive orthodoxy. Let me do a little history lesson, I guess. Is the best way. So we've had various parties, more so in the Church of England, like affirming Catholicism, which have done, been like, we hold to the faith, but we also believe in women's ordination in particular there, but also sexual orientation questions. For us in inclusive orthodoxy, grassroots, I mean, a lot of it actually is defined by the existing sort of two-party system of the church that has existed for the last 10 to 15 years, since the mid-2000s, when pretty much all the conservative evangelicals left the Episcopal Church. Is that you have a party of mainline liberal progressives who, have varying opinions on Jack Spong and Pike and all these other super duper progressive thinkers who are, some of the biggest and most important fighters that we've had for inclusion in the church. And they're great. And sometimes when they talk about theology, it makes me want to tear my hair out, and I don't have a lot left. We have we have that party, and then we have the more traditionalist conservative party, which has disagreed with, and in many cases I commend them for staying faithful to the Episcopal Church and not schisming. But they do disagree with us on matters of inclusion, but generally I agree with them on most theological concerns. And that was something that I'd experienced. I've been a deputy or alternate deputy to General Convention of the Episcopal Church, which is our legislative body equivalent to the ACC's General Synod, which just happened for you all. And that was sort of one of my experiences, that you've got these really great liberals who were making a lot of good points and pushing us forward on inclusion. And then they were talking about prayer book revision. It's like, I think it's okay that we call God Father, actually. I think the creeds as they stand are fine. I have no issue with any of them. And so I think that's sort of how it started, was that at least to me, I've defined it in relation to the two existing parties. But I think we have seen amongst younger people in the last 6 or so years a real growth of the movement, in part because I think younger people in general, and certainly autistic younger people, find sort of both of the options that are presented to be unsatisfying by the other two parties.
Yep. Yeah, so I think that makes sense. One of the ways that I often describe it is theologically conservative as you would typically understand it, with an exception for questions related to gender and sexuality. I know some inclusive Orthodox people don't like that characterization, but that's generally speaking how
I am a theological conservative. I'm theologically Orthodox. I'll call myself conservative. I don't hate it. There is to say that we built out an exception is, I
Yeah,
don't know. I don't think
that's the thing that people take issue with. They take issue with me saying with the exception for like
yeah. I mean, I
gender and
think of,
sexuality.
I'm going to use a metaphor that I really frickin' hate, which is Richard Hooker's three-legged stool that didn't
Mm,
exist.
yes.
There are many great articles about the three-legged stool that didn't exist. Google it. Those people are actual scholars on Richard Hooker. I just read him very occasionally when I have to. But, it's Hooker's idea, at least, was that scripture is sort of our guiding line, and then tradition and reason help us understand it better and to discern where God is calling us to. And I think that reason has taught us in the way that our society has moved forward now that LGBTQ plus people are to be fully accepted and are completely normal. It's not a mental condition, it's just who God's made them to be. But also at the same time, I don't think that we've had reason the reasonable changes yet or progress that would allow us to say, okay, maybe we should take Father out of our prayers, or we should. This whole praying to saints thing is weird. Let's just put up Anne Frank. Let's put a picture of Anne Frank up on our saint wall next to MLK Jr. Like, there is a line about what we can reason and think about, and I feel like inclusion is one place where we've moved forward a lot in the last few centuries.
One thing that I find a lot is most people in the inclusive Orthodox movement are either Episcopal or Anglican. And is this only an Episcopal and Anglican movement, or is there sort of broader acceptance amongst other denominations?
Yeah. So it came out of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion. Earth and Altar primarily publishes from Episcopal Anglican authors, but that is not to say that there are not equivalents in other denominations, whether they know it or not. As I mentioned, I have a master's from Princeton Seminary. I just graduated in May, and I know a lot of my classmates there who, if they knew about the inclusive orthodoxy movement, would call themselves that. I've had multiple non-Episcopal seminarians who have written for Earth and Altar from PTS. We've had people from other Christian traditions who all tend to agree with us on this. Because I don't think it has to be an Episcopal only thing, but it did certainly start in and is most visible in the Episcopal Church and Anglican Communion. But
Yeah.
anybody's welcome.
Cool. Yeah. So I've often also seen inclusive orthodoxy been described as a revival movement or a reform movement. Would you say that's accurate, or would you differ on that?
I don't think so. Perhaps it's because I don't want to. A, I don't feel comfortable claiming revival. B, for specific reasons, I don't feel comfortable claiming reform for specific reasons. I think a lot of it, to look back at Hooker and the three-legged stool, the Via Media, the middle way, something very classically Anglican about it. And perhaps this appeals to me as a historian, is just that this is returning us to what we were meant to be, which was that Anglicanism, from the time that it was founded, has operated in sort of a middle ground, and that we are in the middle, which means that we can accept and welcome people from both sides and from no side at all.
Yeah, so does the inclusive orthodoxy movement have any goals or any aims or like a desired end state or something like that, or not really?
We're not that organized. God, no, we're not. There is a broadness in it. I think all of us are very happy at the wins that we've been getting in the realm of inclusion in the church. I think that's something that we can all say, yes, that's all something we support and want to keep moving forward with. I think we start to get into thornier stuff around theology and politics, because you have people in the inclusive orthodoxy movement who are very much like, center or right of center. And then we've got, I'm relatively far on the left. We've got one of our editors at Earth and Altar is an anarchist who writes on anarchy stuff on a regular basis. That's just, I think I think what we want is to keep the church faithful to the creeds that we believe and confess, and to ensuring that all of God's children are welcome in the church.
Yeah. So I think that's basically what I would say. So I
Yeah.
mean, I approach these things from a sort of my own analytical lens that I've been trained to look at things for. So even if you don't have stated goals, I still think the movement has goals or desired end states. And the way I would define it is, I think a lot of inclusive orthodoxy wants to return to a more traditional understanding of the Christian faith, and is concerned with excesses of liberal theology.
Yes.
And when I say liberal theology, I don't mean liberal as in liberal political, but like the specific branch of theology called liberal theology,
Yes.
or things like, you mentioned Pike and Spong. For those who aren't aware, they're very theologically liberal in the sense that, you ask them, did Jesus rise from the dead? And they waffle on for quite a while trying to say
Yes.
many words but not say a whole lot about those types of things. And
Hmm.
there's a sort of, I mean, I give this example just because it's one I've experienced, but
Yeah.
I had a sermon in one of the Anglican churches that I was attending on Transfiguration Sunday, where the sermon was all about the young adult novel Twilight, and how Edward was sparkling, similar to the way that Jesus was transfigured, and the whole sermon was about that type of thing.
Nope. No.
Yeah,
What are we doing here?
the same priest on Christmas Eve preached a homily about how she didn't think that the virgin birth was important and things like that, and how this isn't something that Christians should concern themselves with. And on Trinity Sunday, a different priest in the Anglican Church of Canada preached a sermon about how the Trinity didn't actually matter and it isn't the only way to think about God. And inclusive orthodoxy wants to move away from that, I would say. Most people within the inclusive Orthodox movement would want to move away from that and return to more traditional ways of thinking about Christianity. Like you said, the creeds are the sort of rallying point that most of them have. Like we actually do believe the creeds, like you said, without crossing our fingers.
Yeah.
And
I
and
think,
that is not the state of most mainline churches in North America. I would say, I'm not sure what the state is
yeah.
in America, but certainly in Canada, that is not how I would describe the state of the Anglican Church. And there's a desire to return to a more theological orthodoxy in
Yeah.
there as well.
So I think, yeah, I like your point about sort of curbing the excesses. I do feel that if we have any goal, it's to keep the church together, keep the church united. We've had one of our founding editors served on our denomination's task force on communion across difference, which was founded after a lot of schism happened so that we could keep people with conservative and traditional beliefs around marriage and gender and sexuality in the fold of the Episcopal Church. And so I think that's important. And one of the key things I think brought us together is a thing that was called Resurrection Gate, if you've ever heard of that.
Please explain for the podcast audience.
Yeah. So Resurrection Gate was in 2019. I am Googling it right now just to make sure that I am quoting it correctly. Serene Jones, who is a theologian in an ordained clergy person in the Disciples of Christ and United Church of Christ, did a interview with Nick Kristof for the New York Times for Easter, where she said where she cast out on the physical resurrection and said that the virgin birth was a bizarre claim. And a bunch of people online, including myself, all kind of reacted badly to the president of one of the most well-known seminaries in the country saying that.
Yeah.
And so, but also, and we were living at that time in Trump 1.0, so we could also see the excesses of a specific conservative Christian nationalistic theology as well. And that's
Yeah.
something, quick plug, that's something that we've been talking about in one of our most recent series on Earth and Altar, which is called Faithful Resistance. There's lots of great article about what resistance as a Christian looks like against unjust governments, unjust leaders, that sort of thing at this time right now.
Yeah. And so I would say, like, curbing the excesses of sort of liberal progressive theology and bringing us back to a more conservative theology, but also at the same time pushing against the other side, which is the sort of attempt to return to a traditionalist sexual ethic. And this is something that I see a lot of people criticizing inclusive orthodoxy for. They go, bringing the main line back to the creeds, yes, great, let's do that. But then they go, but wait, isn't sexual ethics actually like really important and really necessary for orthodoxy? Like, don't we need these things in it?
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
I do think we need sexual ethics. I just think we need a different sexual ethic. I think we need one that is informed by the experiences of queer people and the way that queer theologians help us understand God and understand queer people better through God. And I think that's something that is really important. I'm trying to think of a better way to say it than really important, but I do think, and I'm not a queer theology expert. That was not what I took a lot of my theology classes in seminary. But I do think that it's important for us to be able to say and listen to relatively traditional theologians who are saying, okay, maybe we should understand sexual ethics and marriage between any two people through this lens rather than this lens.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to point out, just because inclusive orthodoxy does touch on a lot of like LGBTQ issues, there are a whole bunch of different ways within affirming Christianities to justify the inclusion of same-sex marriage or transition or women's ordination and things like that. And I think it's also important to explain that inclusive orthodoxy tends, at least the ones I've seen, tend to take a very particular way of reading the reasons that we should be inclusive. So if you read some affirming Christians, they will say things like, well, you see, the Bible was written by people who didn't know any better. It's not inerrant. We shouldn't see this as the word of God. This was like a helpful guide for people at the time and doesn't hold as much authority anymore, and we should relegate this to our reason and our ability to think through these things. In a lot of affirming theologies will downplay the significance of scripture and tradition. However, inclusive orthodoxy, I think it's important to mention, does not do that move. The inclusive orthodoxy, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, the interpretation of the reasons that we should be LGBT inclusive or inclusive on questions like women's ordination are ones related to, or the reasons are related to hermeneutics and specific ways of reading scriptures or church tradition in a way that they would say is concordant and consistent with the other theological views. I don't know if I'm saying that.
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. Some resources that I think are really helpful. I've read part of it, not full, but Sarah Coakley, the theologian, the American theologian, Episcopal priest, wrote a book called God, Sexuality, and the Self, an essay on the Trinity. Highly recommend. She does some good stuff there about gender and sexuality and feminism in particular. I will always come back to, though, The Body's Grace by Rowan Williams. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, gave a lecture in the late 80s where he basically sort of deconstructs the idea of sex is for procreation only. And then, through poetry, but also through theology and biblical hermeneutics, and then eventually coming to the point of, if sex was created for pleasure, not just procreation, then people who want to have sexual encounters with people who are not of the assigned gender that they are supposed to should be able to do so as well.
Hey everyone. If you're enjoying this podcast and want to support my work, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting if you're listening on YouTube, or rating and reviewing the podcast on whatever app you listen to it on. Some people have asked me if they can support my research work and podcast or encourage me to continue doing this work that many autistic people find valuable. If my work has been helpful for you and you have the means to do so, I would appreciate if you could make a single donation or sign up for recurring monthly donations to the Against Malaria Foundation. I'll provide a link in the description. This is a very effective charity that helps prevent malaria by donating bed nets to people who need them. Each net costs around $2 and lasts for 3 to 4 years and protects on average 2 people. The statistics on this are well known. Every 600 nets that are provided saves 1 child from dying of malaria, and around 500 to 1,000 cases of malaria get prevented. Every single net matters. Even if you can only make a small donation, I would greatly appreciate it, as it really helps motivate me. So far, we've already raised well over $500, and I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much to everyone who contributed. This does make a difference, and this really does help me want to continue pursuing this work. In addition, this podcast has merch. We use Teespring as a provider. I can provide a link in the description. There you can find many fun stickers that have themes that come up in this podcast, shirts, or mugs. Any of the proceeds from the merch will be donated to the Against Malaria Foundation and shared with the artists. That's all for now. Back to the podcast. Yeah, and so I want to sort of explore this specific thing more closely, mostly because this is one of the sort of porous boundary layers of inclusive orthodoxy, where it's very difficult to tell where inclusive orthodoxy stops and something else starts, and maybe there aren't clear starting and stopping lines. But in affirming Christian circles, we have terms like side A, side B, side X, side Y. I'm pretty sure inclusive orthodox would not include side X or side Y. Could inclusive orthodoxy include side B, or is it strictly side A?
I don't want to put boundaries. I don't want to put that many boundaries up on it. I mean, I think it depends on what the person specifically understands about side B. Side B, I think if you are an LGBTQ plus person who is personally side B, in that you want to be called to a chaste vocation through celibacy or whatever, that's fine. I'm very civil libertarian about a lot of things. Do your life. You do you, king or queen or ruler. But yeah. But we do end up, I think if you're a side B-er and that's not a side B for you, but you want other people to be side B, that's sort of where my issue comes in.
Yeah.
And I think...
So a person who is side B, but side B is the correct position for Christians, wouldn't be part of inclusive orthodoxy.
Yeah, if they want everybody else to hold to it. Yes.
Cool. That makes sense. So anything else relevant to mention about what inclusive orthodoxy is?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Cool.
Yeah, it's all there in the name.
Yeah, it is all there in the name, but I think it is useful to just go over what it is and what it isn't, mostly because I myself have been quite confused of what exactly it is.
Oh, I get it.
One of the difficult things is anyone can call themselves inclusive orthodox, so you will have people who will call themselves inclusive orthodox, but also when you ask them, did Jesus bodily resurrect from the dead, will give long waffling answers that are like, I don't know, he could have, maybe, and they'll call themselves inclusive orthodox. And some people say, well, that person's not, and that person is. But anyway, I think most people by now should have a relatively good idea of what the position of inclusive orthodoxy is. So now I want to talk about autistic people and their involvement
Yes.
in inclusive orthodoxy. Are you yourself, Richard, aware of how many autistic people are interested in these movements, just like from vibes?
I don't know the number, but I expect it's got to be a majority.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So there are a lot of people who are interested in inclusive orthodoxy if they are autistic. The difficulty is finding exact precise numbers because a lot of them don't know what inclusive orthodoxy is.
Yeah.
So I've put out surveys, I've asked people during interviews questions like, "Are you inclusive orthodox?" And they'll say no. And because they think that's like a denomination like Eastern
Yes.
Orthodox, uh, or have an understanding like that, or just not really know what it is. And so they'll say no. But then when you get into the theology questions, are you affirming of same-sex marriage and women's ordination? They go, yes, yes. And then also, do you agree with the Nicene Creed? Do you think that's important? Do you think this is a good way to sort of delineate who is and who is not Christian and that type of thing? And they go, oh yeah, of course. Like, of course, the Nicene Creed is the sort of thing we use to gatekeep who is in, who is out, and things like that. It's like, okay, well, you said you
Hmm.
weren't inclusive Orthodox, but I think that's pretty close to it, or sort of underneath the umbrella. So getting precise numbers is quite hard. And I also
Hmm.
found it really depends on age. So I found the under 35 group
Yep.
is disproportionately inclusive Orthodox, disproportionate in a pretty large way. So I would say the majority, but like 51%, think 51%, not like 90% when I say majority here. The majority of 18 to 35 autistics in Protestant denominations are inclusive Orthodox. If they're aware of it, or if they aren't aware, they hold to or espouse positions that would put them well within inside the boundaries of inclusive Orthodox. And so this is just autistic Christians.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, about half of autistic Protestants who describe themselves as Protestants are inclusive Orthodox or close to inclusive Orthodox. This starts to drop significantly once you get over the age of 35.
Yep.
It'll drop down to around 15 to 20% when you get over 35, but under 35, you're in that majority. When it comes to Catholics, so Catholics between the age of 18 to 35, around 1 in 4 will explicitly identify as inclusive Orthodox. Above 35, it drops really significantly, like nearly off a cliff. So from 1 to 4 to like 1 in 50 is probably where it goes. Orthodox autistics are around 1 in 10, age 18 to 35, will identify as inclusive Orthodox. And again, radically falls off a cliff once you get over 35. And that's basically how it breaks down. However, if you were to take any sort of grouping of autistic Christians, and if you were to be able to label them as any theological position, the largest contiguous faction within all the autistic Christians that I have been able to survey would be inclusive Orthodox, sitting at around between 35 to 40% of all Christians that I've been able to survey would fall in that. And keep in mind, this is English speaking Western world online,
Yeah.
so that's going to skew numbers, but those are generally speaking where most of them fall. Does any of that surprise you?
Not really.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also really funny. So I like to use certain accounts or certain publications to find other autistic Christians. And one of the ways that I find more autistic Christians for my research is by following prominent inclusive orthodoxy accounts and just seeing who interacts with them. And
Yep.
then if you interact with them, looking through all your posts, or if you have a linked blog, looking at your linked blog and looking to see if you identify as autistic in any of those. And that has been very fruitful in finding autistic Christians. And so just from finding them alone, tracking them through those sources is like one of the go-to places where I tell people, if you want to find autistic Christians, just like find contributors to Earth and Altar and then follow them and then look who's commenting on their posts or on their blogs, and you're probably going to find autistic Christians in the mix. and that's probably the most consistent way that you can find them. Yeah, so the biggest thing I think that controls for that is age. Age has been the only sort of consistent thing that I found really makes a difference. So once you get above 35, and if you're autistic and Christian, the chances that you will be affirming are significantly less. The issue that the over 35s take is with some form of affirming. So they might be LGB
Yeah.
and not T affirming, especially with autistic Christian women, even under 35. Autistic Christian women in the UK might be LGB affirming, but not LGBT
Oh,
affirming.
yeah.
I've talked about that in previous episodes. If you want to know more, there is pretty overwhelming support from autistic Christians for women's ordination. But then they go, yes, women's ordination, no LGBT. There are lots of variations, but overall, the ones who would take the sort of full inclusive package and the full orthodoxy package are mostly between the ages of 18 to 35.
Mhm.
Yeah, so why is this is another great question.
Yeah.
And so maybe I'll ask you, why do you think that autistic Christians are so disproportionately interested in inclusive orthodoxy?
I think it has to do with the traits that autistic people have in general. When you talked about how over 35, the number of people that are affirming drops, I was like, that actually makes sense to me because you've lived for 35 or however many years, probably with this belief, and you really don't want to change it because change is hard. And change is especially hard for autistic people who like routines and the like. So that makes sense. I think one thing about autistic people that sort of I think predispositions us for inclusive orthodoxy is the fact that we're blunt. We tell it like it is. We don't really care about your feelings sometimes.
Some of us really care about feelings, but some of us
Some of us
really
really
don't.
care about feelings. Some of us are getting better with feelings. But I think, again, to talk about what I brought up earlier about the way that inclusive orthodoxy started as sort of a point of reference between two warring parties, I think we sort of see I don't want to call it hypocrisy because that's mean, but to some extent the hypocrisy, the way that people pick and choose in these two parties. Conservative evangelicals will love to tell you about all these verses about this says gay people are bad. But I think there's that is that you believe so hard in that, but you ignore a lot of the stuff that Jesus says about welcoming, or the way that you interpret Jesus's relationship with money and that sort of thing. And then on the other side, it's like, we're really glad that you agree that Jesus calls us to be welcome, to be good stewards of the earth, all this great stuff. Yes. But then you ignore all the bits where the only time that Jesus addresses the first person of the Trinity in the Bible, he only ever calls the first person Father. Or that Jesus does say that to be Christian, you actually do have to believe stuff.
Yeah.
And that there is doubt, yes, but that doubt is that Jesus restores and works through people with doubt, not just saying, okay, you can have doubt for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And so basically, I think those are some of the factors that feed into it. So something we've been sort of talking about, autistic Christians, generally speaking, if they call themselves Christian, tend to be pretty theologically conservative on the sort of central issues. So they tend to really care about the creeds. Now, this is something I've talked about in previous episodes, where when I first started doing this research, I didn't expect this. I expected a more theological liberalism, and was sort of surprised to find that almost uniformly throughout autistic Christians, there is a pretty theologically conservative streak. And this is often like a survivorship bias problem, where the types of autistic people who stay in Christianity are the types of people who have theologically conservative views on things, whereas
Mhm.
autistic people who hold to more theologically liberal ideas will tend to just deconvert and or leave Christianity or ask, what's the point in doing this? Like, I don't get it. I don't get why we're here if this is all a metaphor, right?
Yep.
A lot of us don't do particularly well with the sort of metaphorical, loosey-goosey type of theological attribution.
No.
And so for all that, we tend to take it quite seriously. If the creeds say this, then we're on board with the creeds. And generally speaking, not super open to liberal or progressive theologies. Again,
Yes.
there are exceptions to this, and
Hmm.
there are variations within that, and there are various different epistemologies, but generally speaking, you will find
Hmm.
a theological seriousness about we actually need to believe something.
Yes.
Like there is no point in doing this if we don't actually believe it, as Paul has famously said. The next biggest one is one that I think a lot of people miss in this topic, which is that autistic people in general have very, very high contact with LGBTQ people. Just in general, if you are autistic, the chances that you know other autistics are quite high, and the chances that some of those autistics or you yourself are LGBT or Q are very high. So, autistic people are disproportionately LGBT or Q, and like there are many potential explanations for it. I think everyone's attempts to explain it are bad and they don't quite understand it, but the fact remains, just
Yeah.
disproportionately we are disproportionately that. So the chances that you will either have friends that are LGBT or uh, you yourself will be are very high, and many autistic Christians aren't particularly interested in a Christianity that does not include those people,
Yeah.
or not interested in a version of Christianity, or have a really difficult time trying to resolve the cognitive dissonance that comes from wanting to take Christianity very seriously, but also at the same time having to essentially condemn everyone you know as a terrible person. And often with, again, more theologically conservative theologies, it isn't just like gay people are in a state of sin, it's that they're corruptors, they're coming for your kids, you know,
Yes.
they're here to destroy you. And you know a lot of gay people and you're like,
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think they're much more interested in Magic the Gathering than destroying the social fabric of our country. And so that tension is very difficult to resolve.
Hmm.
And so often we will explicitly go looking for ways to resolve this tension. And the way to resolve this tension, as for most autistic people, is intellectualization. So
Yep.
the most common way that autistic people resolve their cognitive dissonance is by reading books, watching videos, listening to podcasts, and things like that. And the ways that inclusive Orthodox people tend to speak about these issues are ways that just typically resonate with autistic patterns of thinking, and the types of things that autistic people like are usually the way that inclusive Orthodox people lay things out. They lay things out pretty clearly. They will often give long, well reasoned essays or have entire books about these things. And they will also reason about things in a way that is theologically simpatico or consistent with the way that a lot of autistic people think about Christianity. And so I think that's a really big one. And sort of related to that, inclusive orthodoxy, as we started off this episode with, is filled with a lot of weird nerds. And that is the sort of place where autistic people thrive. And you go from your little enclave of Christianity where people might not be as interested in discussing the particular context of sexual ethics in the Greco-Roman world, to a place where that's all people want to talk about. And you often are like, oh, I quite like this, I quite like these people, I like the cut of their jib. Generally speaking, autistic people prefer the company of other autistic people. We
Hmm.
tend to be able to communicate with each other much more clearly, and we communicate in a way that the other person picks up on better. And so whenever you get a sort of critical mass of autistic people in any social setting, you tend to attract more autistic people just by virtue of the fact that you have people who can effectively communicate to them in a way that they're
Mhm.
not used to being effectively communicated to. And so I think that just like high concentration of intellectual people and autistic people combined creates sort of ideal conditions to bringing in more autistic people,
Yeah.
getting more autistic people interested. Inclusive orthodoxy is also like a very online movement. Like you said, it sort of emerged from Twitter.
Yes.
And so a lot of autistic people spend a lot of their time online and are likely to encounter them and likely to encounter them on Twitter, especially if they're interested in Christianity.
Yeah.
If you're interested in this type of thing, the chances that you will run into an inclusive Orthodox person online is pretty high. If you're in these circles, the algorithm will just deliver them to you at some point. And so I think all those factors come in, combine, and create this sort of perfect storm that just attracts more autistic people to it. And it's this feedback loop that keeps drawing more in. So
Yeah.
anything else that you think might be relevant to add on the why are so many autistic people inclusive Orthodox? I think that's the easiest, most concise way
Yeah.
to
I mean,
explain
I
it.
think, yeah. And just sort of, I think I made my point that I wanted to
Yeah,
there.
yeah. I often make the point that the church is really bad at communicating Christianity to autistic people. I think one of the exceptions to that is the inclusive Orthodox movement. I think they're pretty okay at communicating Christianity to autistic people in a way that they'll understand, and often just more willing to answer questions and accommodate. So I have asked many questions of many people in the inclusive Orthodox movement, and they, like many of the priests, and they have all been very eager to respond to me and take on my questions, criticisms, and critiques. And so yeah, generally speaking, that's why they like it. So the
Yeah.
next question is, why do some of us not like it? Why do some of us move away from it? If you had to guess what the biggest reason that autistic people reject inclusive orthodoxy, what would you think it would be?
The inclusion bit.
Yeah, exactly,
You,
exactly.
you kind of hinted at that earlier.
Yeah, yeah. So the difficulty with inclusive orthodoxy is a lot of autistic people find it difficult to sign on to all of it. They will be able to sign on to parts of it, but they won't be able to follow the inclusion to its most logical extent. Or they will have an attitude of, this is an accommodation that we're making for you because that's what we're doing. Like, this is something this is not something that we should be doing. This is basically a pragmatic, practical accommodation that we're making. A lot of autistic people are also just like really interested in theology, and their reading of theology or church history leads them to the position, which is basically, yeah, sexual ethics is incredibly important to Christianity, and sexual ethics, as understood by the church for most of its time, is actually really important. And of course, inclusive Orthodox people will say, yes, we are in line with that tradition, but a lot of autistic people will disagree with them and say,
Mhm.
I think this marks a departure, or at least a significant departure from that. There are a lot of issues that autistic people have with scrupulosity
Yes.
and religious OCD and things like that, where there are issues of very significant import in Christianity. And if you give them the option of erring on the side of caution or erring on the side of tradition, they will often just prefer to err on that side and not risk going out on something new, because they often play the loop in their head. Well, I'd like to be affirming, but what if I'm affirming sin? Is that
Yeah.
going to weigh on my eternal soul, or
Yes.
things like that? That comes up quite a lot. And
I
just
think
like,
it's.
yeah, oh, go
I
ahead.
think a lot of it's about how we are raised.
Yeah,
Um, I think that as we've been talking about this, and you brought up, and we discussed earlier the idea that beyond the age of 35, the chance that you are inclusive drops significantly. So one of the greatest things about my life is that like I've got a great family, and my one of my dad's first cousins is a lesbian, has been with her now wife for since long before I was born. They have a son together who's like a decade older than me almost. And they just, I've known them my whole life. I've loved them my whole life. I didn't know a world where gay people weren't present and important and celebrated as the people who they are. And I think that there are some people that don't get that opportunity. And certainly if you're over 35, the chance that you did is probably significantly lower than if you're under 35. So I do think that sort of scrupulosity around that and the way that each of us were raised, and again, change.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're also just like people who just read the hermeneutic strategies of inclusive Orthodox people and for their own intellectual reasons are like, nope, I don't really buy that. That isn't how we should be reading things. And they're sort of like, why inclusive Orthodoxy when I can just do orthodoxy? That sounds a lot better. But yeah, you'll also get cases like I had mentioned earlier and like I had alluded to earlier of the interest or the acceptance of LGB but not T, or
Yes.
in some cases the acceptance of T but not LGB. That is also a thing.
Really? Okay.
Yes. So I ask autistic people to rate their inclusion for LGB people on a 4-axis scale of social inclusion, civic inclusion, hermeneutic, and moral intuition. And then I asked them to rate the same for trans people. And after fully affirming, the next most common option is affirming, like hermeneutically. They will say there's a good case that could be made for trans people, but not a good case that could be made for gay people. And when they're looking at that, so that's a fun fact. Yeah. So
Wow, that is something I've never heard.
really,
Yeah.
oh yeah, I hear it all the time. Now, are they inclusive of trans people? Also, no. But they think that there's a case that could be made for it in a way that they don't think there could be a case for same-sex sexual relationships. Yeah, so that's the thing. But yeah, that's generally speaking why they reject it to some extent. Anyway, yeah, that is inclusive orthodoxy. Do you have anything you would like to plug, Richard?
Obviously, our website, earthandaltarmag.com, we've got a lot of great stuff, including our Faithful Resistance series. I will also plug my personal Substack, which is affliction advancing flight.substack.com, where I post mostly my sermons, but I'm working on a few articles for that. And if you are a liturgy nerd like me, Arlie Coles and I are the maintainers of the Episcopal Chant database, where you will have all the resources that you need to chant a lot of the service on that website, episcopalchant.com. And we also, along with John Wallace, run Metrical Collects, which is we found a woman named Eliza Humphreys who wrote versification poems of the collects from the Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer from 1662. And we have set them to music and put them up online to sing them. There's some pretty cool, fun new hymn tunes there.
Cool. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. My name is John. You can find me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. If you'd like to email me, you can find me on Twitter at christianityon, or you can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. Just another thank you for everyone who has so far contributed to our Malaria Nets campaign. It warms my heart to see it, and it genuinely does help motivate me continue on this research and this work when people contribute to it. If you can, and if you can afford it, please consider donating to that. You can also buy the podcast merch, the proceeds of which will be donated to the artists and to more Malaria Nets. Anyway, that's all for me. See you later.